3 days before the biggest signing ceremony of the year, a company refused to pay a quiet single man $40 for 8 hours of honest work and told him to take it to court if he wanted it so badly. Nobody in that glass tower bothered to ask what he had spent the day doing or why his hands were still faintly dusted with concrete residue when he stood at the payment counter waiting patiently for a form that never seemed to arrive. Elias Mercer did not raise his voice. He did not slam his palm on the counter or demand to see a manager the way another man might have after being humiliated in front of an entire lobby of strangers. He simply closed his laptop bag, slid the folder of photographs and readings back inside it, and walked out into the cold autumn rain that had been falling over Chicago since morning. His coat collar turned up against the wind as he crossed the parking lot without once looking back at the building behind him. What none of them understood, not the receptionist who laughed under her breath, not the accountant who shrugged and moved on to the next task, not even the woman who gave the order to make him wait as though his time carried no weight at all, was that the man leaving their building was the only structural risk consultant who had actually found the flaw buried inside their newest tower, a flaw that could unravel a deal worth more than $1 billion. 72 hours later, in front of bankers, partners, and reporters in the middle of the most important contract signing of the entire year, the room would go silent as investors stared down at the very report the company had mocked, and the number written at the bottom of the settlement would read $12 million, a figure that would follow the company's name through headlines for months to come. Elias Mercer was 41 years old and he had built a quiet, steady life out of precision. He worked as an independent structural inspector and risk assessor, the kind of professional companies called when they needed a second set of eyes they could trust completely, someone with no stake in the outcome except the truth. He had been divorced for several years, and though he lived alone now in a modest apartment on the north side of the city, his days were shaped by discipline rather than sentiment. He measured twice, documented everything, and never signed his name to anything he had not personally verified. Colleagues who had worked alongside him over the years described him the same way, almost without exception, calling him unhurried, unshakable, and impossible to rattle, the sort of man who could deliver bad news about a failing beam with the same even tone he used to discuss the weather. He had learned that steadiness early in his career, back when a louder, more excitable inspector might have been dismissed as alarmist and ignored entirely. Quiet certainty, he had come to believe, carried further than noise ever could. That morning, Ashcroft Urban Holdings had called him in on short notice, needing an emergency inspection completed within a single day before their flagship tower could be cleared for a major investment closing. The call had come from a mid-level project coordinator who sounded frazzled, explaining that their usual inspection firm had a scheduling conflict and that the timeline could not slip even by a day. Elias had cleared his calendar, packed his laser equipment, his cameras, and his notebooks, and arrived before sunrise to begin walking every floor of the structure. He worked alone, as he always did, moving from the underground levels upward with methodical patience, pausing at every junction, every seam, every place where one material met another, carrying with him the quiet certainty that thoroughness now would prevent far greater trouble later. By the time the sun had fully risen over the skyline, he had already logged more measurements than most inspectors would take in a full week, filling page after page of his notebook with careful, legible handwriting that left no room for later confusion. By early afternoon, he had completed the full survey, moving methodically through mechanical rooms, load-bearing corridors, and the underground parking structure that supported the entire weight of the building above it. He worked with the same unhurried thoroughness in every section, crouching beside support columns, running his gloved hand along seams in the concrete, and cross-checking each area against the blueprints loaded onto his tablet. Something in the third sublevel caught his attention immediately, a section of reinforcement that did not match the original specifications on file, the kind of detail that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically trained to look for it. He photographed it from several angles, took laser measurements to confirm the deviation, and noted the anomaly carefully in his preliminary report before continuing his walk-through, unwilling to let the discovery rush the remainder of his work. When the inspection was finished, he submitted his findings to the front desk exactly as instructed, handing over a printed summary along with a note that a more detailed report would follow within the day, and asked politely about payment for the day's work, a modest sum of $40 that had been agreed upon as a processing fee, separate from his full consulting invoice, which would be billed later through standard channels. The woman behind the counter looked at her screen, frowned, and told him there was a delay, something about a missing signature from finance that she could not resolve on her own. Elias nodded and said he would wait, setting his equipment case down beside the bench without any hint of impatience in his expression. He waited for nearly 2 hours in the lobby, seated on a leather bench beneath a wall of framed awards the company had won for architectural excellence. Employees passed him without a glance, phones pressed to their ears, coffee cups in hand, the ordinary rhythm of a company convinced that nothing could touch it. Twice he approached the front desk to ask politely whether there had been any update, and twice the young receptionist offered the same apologetic shrug, explaining that finance handled disbursements on its own schedule and that there was little she could do to speed things along. Elias thanked her both times and returned to the bench without complaint, setting his equipment case carefully beside his feet and continuing to review his photographs on his tablet while he waited. Eventually, the CEO herself crossed through the lobby on her way to a meeting. Vivian Ashcroft was 39 years old, sharp-featured, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that made her look like she had stepped directly out of a business magazine cover. She noticed him only because an assistant murmured something about a vendor complaint, glancing briefly toward the man seated near the awards wall. When she learned the entire holdup concerned a sum as small as $40, she let out a short, dismissive laugh that echoed across the marble floor. $40, she repeated, loud enough for the small cluster of employees nearby to hear, and asked if he was really planning to stand there over an amount that small when there were people in this building closing deals worth more than his entire yearly income before lunch. A few of the younger staff members laughed along with her, the kind of laughter that comes not from real amusement, but from the instinct to align with power. Elias looked up from his seat, met her eyes for a moment, and said nothing at all, which seemed to irritate her more than any protest could have. Vivian turned to her assistant without waiting for a response and said simply that he could wait, that finance would get to it eventually, and that she had a meeting to attend that mattered considerably more than a vendor invoice for pocket change. Elias said nothing. He watched her disappear down the corridor toward the executive elevators, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. When the accountant finally returned with a form labeled Unpaid Services Pending Review, he read it once, signed it without complaint, and slid it back across the counter without a trace of frustration in his expression. He gathered his equipment case, buttoned his coat against the chill that had already crept into the lobby whenever the doors opened, and walked out through the revolving doors into the rain that had been building steadily throughout the afternoon, the kind of steady autumn rain that soaked through fabric slowly rather than all at once. Nobody who watched him leave imagined that the calm, unremarkable man crossing the parking lot was carrying, inside a worn leather folder, the single most important piece of information the company would need in the days ahead, and that his silence in that lobby was not resignation but the quiet decision of a man who had learned long ago that dignity did not require raising his voice. On the drive home, Elias stopped at a red light and reached for his tablet, paging back through the images he had captured that morning in the third sublevel. The deviation bothered him more the longer he studied it. The original architectural plans called for a specific grade of reinforced steel across the primary load-bearing beam supporting the tower's northern wing, yet the material actually installed did not match those specifications. It was subtle enough that a rushed inspection might have missed it entirely, the kind of difference that revealed itself only under close measurement rather than a casual glance. But Elias had spent 2 decades learning to notice exactly this kind of quiet substitution, the sort that saved a contractor money in the short term while leaving a structure vulnerable under sustained stress over years of use. He pulled the car into a parking spot outside his apartment and sat there with the engine off for several minutes, cross-referencing his laser readings against the manufacturer specifications stored in his files, checking and rechecking the numbers until he was certain there was no error in his own measurements. If left uncorrected, the deficiency would very likely fail to meet the standards required by the building's insurance underwriters, a detail that could jeopardize far more than the tower itself. Beyond the immediate safety concern, Elias understood that any due diligence process conducted by a serious investment partner would eventually uncover the same discrepancy, whether through his report or through an entirely separate inspection commissioned later. The responsible course, as he saw it, was simple and did not require dramatics. Someone at Ashcroft Urban Holdings needed to know, needed to correct the deficiency, and needed to do so before outside parties relied on the building's safety rating to make decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. He had no interest in punishing anyone or proving a point. He wanted only for the correction to happen. That evening, from his kitchen table, Elias composed a formal warning email to Ashcroft Urban Holdings, attaching his photographs, his laser readings, and a clear written explanation of the risk he had identified. He wrote plainly and without exaggeration, describing the deviation in neutral, technical language, and recommending a follow-up inspection before any documentation moved forward to outside parties. He sent it to the project manager, copied the general contact address for engineering compliance, and waited, checking his inbox periodically throughout the evening, out of habit rather than expectation. No reply came that night, nor the following morning, when he attempted to follow up by phone. The call went unanswered 3 times before a receptionist finally picked up and told him, somewhat awkwardly, that his email address had been blocked from the company's internal system entirely. The decision had been made quietly at Vivian's request after she was briefed on the persistent inspector still trying to reach her office, a request she issued almost as an afterthought between 2 other meetings, viewing the matter as a nuisance rather than anything requiring genuine attention. Miles Donovan, the company's chief counsel, told a junior staffer plainly that nobody needed to bother the CEO over a matter involving $40, and that if the inspector had a real concern, he could put it in writing and mail it the traditional way, knowing full well how long that process could take and how easily it could be ignored once it arrived. Elias, for his part, did not escalate or threaten legal action, and he did not attempt to reach anyone else at the company after learning his access had been cut off. He simply saved every email he had sent, timestamped and organized, into a folder labeled with the building's address, along with screenshots confirming the delivery status of each message and the eventual bounce-back notifications once his address was blocked. He printed hard copies as well, a habit left over from earlier years in his career, and filed them chronologically in a binder he kept in his home office. It was not an act of anger or preparation for revenge, only the same discipline that governed every part of his work, quietly building a record that no one at Ashcroft Urban Holdings yet understood they would come to need. Inside the tower, preparations for the largest transaction in the company's history moved forward without pause, oblivious to the quiet warning sitting unread in a blocked inbox somewhere in the building's own servers. Vivian Ashcroft was preparing to close a deal worth $1.4 billion with one of the most respected investment funds in the country, an agreement that would transform her company from a regional developer into a national name recognized far beyond Chicago. The entire office had been swept into a mood of celebration weeks in advance, banners quietly commissioned, catering arranged, and press releases drafted well before a single signature had been placed on paper. Every detail of the closing ceremony was rehearsed down to the minute. Vivian gave interviews to business journalists throughout that week in which she spoke with total confidence about the soundness of her flagship property, insisting there was no risk whatsoever in the underlying asset, that every inspection had come back clean, and that investors could trust the numbers completely without reservation. She believed this not because she had verified it herself, but because she had never needed to before. Money had always solved her problems, smoothed over her oversights, and silenced the people who might have told her otherwise, and nothing in her experience so far had given her reason to expect that this time would be any different. Rachel Kim, the company's quality control director, was not so certain. At 35, she had spent years quietly reviewing documentation behind the scenes, rarely receiving credit but taking her responsibilities seriously regardless. The kind of employee whose work only became visible when something went wrong. As she assembled the final compliance binder for the investment fund's due diligence team, cross-referencing every page against a checklist she had built and refined over years of similar closings, she noticed a critical gap. the absence of a final signed verification from the independent structural consultant who had completed the emergency inspection days earlier. Without that signature, the entire compliance package was technically incomplete, a detail that could raise uncomfortable questions if anyone examined it closely, and one that her training told her could not simply be overlooked no matter how minor it seemed to everyone else around her. She brought the concern directly to Vivian, expecting a simple instruction to resolve it. Instead, Vivian waved her off without looking up from her desk, saying there was no need to worry about a minor formality from a contractor nobody would remember by the following week. Rachel left the office troubled, and later that evening, without telling anyone, she found Elias Mercer's contact information in the vendor records and placed a call to a number she had been explicitly told not to use. They met the next afternoon in a small coffee shop several blocks from the tower, chosen deliberately because neither of them wanted to be seen together by anyone from the company. Rachel arrived first, choosing a table near the back where the noise of the espresso machine would cover their conversation from anyone who might wander too close. When Elias walked in a few minutes later, carrying his laptop and the same leather folder he had walked out with days earlier, she almost did not recognize him without the fluorescent lighting of the lobby washing out his features. He greeted her with a brief nod, ordered black coffee, and sat down across from her without any of the tension she had expected from a man who had been treated so poorly by her employer only days before. He opened the files without hesitation, showing Rachel the photographs of the substituted material, the laser measurements documenting the deviation from specification, the time-stamped video he had recorded while walking the third sublevel, and the written record of every email he had sent that had gone unanswered. He explained each piece of evidence patiently, translating the technical language into terms she could follow, pointing out exactly where the installed material diverged from the specifications on file and what that divergence meant for the tower's ability to withstand sustained structural stress over time. He told her plainly that he had never wanted a confrontation, only for someone with authority to correct a mistake before it became dangerous, and that he had assumed, naively perhaps, that a company of this size would have a straightforward process for addressing exactly this kind of warning. Rachel felt the color drain from her face as she paged through the evidence on his laptop screen, understanding immediately that this was not a minor paperwork issue but a structural deficiency serious enough to threaten the safety rating of the entire building and, by extension, the deal her company was racing to close. She asked him several pointed questions, testing the strength of his data the way her training had taught her to, searching for any weakness or ambiguity that might explain why the company had dismissed his warning so easily. She found none. Every measurement was documented, every photograph time-stamped, every claim cross-referenced against the original blueprints. By the time she finished reviewing the files, her hands were faintly trembling. Not from fear exactly, but from the growing certainty that she was sitting across from the only person in the entire organization who had told the truth from the very beginning. Rachel returned to the office that same evening and brought the printed report directly to Vivian, laying it on the desk and explaining as calmly as she could manage exactly what the numbers meant and why they mattered so much given the timing of the closing. Vivian barely glanced at the first page before her expression hardened, the polished composure she wore in front of reporters slipping for just a moment into something colder and more impatient. She picked up the report and, without a word of explanation, tore it in half in front of Rachel, letting the pages fall onto the desk between them, and told her that she refused to let a $40 contractor derail a deal that had taken 18 months to negotiate and represented the single largest achievement of her career. Rachel tried to explain the legal exposure the company would face if the fund discovered the deficiency after closing, laying out in careful detail exactly how a concealed structural defect could unravel far more than the immediate transaction, but Vivian was no longer listening, her attention already shifting to the stack of unrelated messages waiting on her desk. Within the hour, Rachel was called into Human Resources and informed that her position was being eliminated effective immediately, her access badge deactivated before she had even cleared out her desk. The years of careful, thankless work she had done for the company were reduced to a single line in a termination file. Miles Donovan, watching the situation unfold from his office down the hall, grew increasingly uneasy as the day progressed. He reminded Vivian privately, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had learned not to push too hard against her certainty, that with Rachel gone the company no longer had anyone internally tracking the independent inspection records, and that if the investment fund's own technical team asked for final documentation, there would be nothing complete to show them. Vivian dismissed the concern outright, insisting that no investor in their right mind would walk away from a deal this size over a missing signature and that she would handle any questions personally if they arose, waving off his hesitation the same way she had waved off Rachel's warnings only hours earlier. Meanwhile, the investment fund's compliance department sent a routine but firm request asking for the final signed structural verification report ahead of the closing date, a standard step in any transaction of this size. Rather than reaching out to Elias to resolve the matter honestly, an option that would have cost her nothing more than a phone call and a moment of humility, Vivian instructed a junior associate to produce a substitute document, one that recreated the format of Elias's report but altered the critical findings to state that no deficiencies had been identified anywhere in the structure. She reviewed the falsified version herself before it was sent, made a small note about adjusting the formatting to look more official, and approved it without hesitation, believing it would never be checked against the original and that the entire matter would quietly disappear once the deal was signed. What Vivian did not know was that Noah Whitmore, the 56-year-old chairman of the investment fund preparing to finalize the acquisition, had a long-standing habit of verifying anything that seemed too clean. Something about the abrupt turnover in Ashcroft's quality control department, mentioned only in passing by a junior staffer during a routine call, struck him as worth a closer look. Rather than raising the issue through official channels, Noah quietly had his assistant track down the original inspector listed in the company's vendor records, and within a day Elias Mercer received a formal letter requesting a private meeting, signed personally by the chairman himself. The meeting took place in a modest conference room at the fund's downtown offices, far removed from the polished theatrics of Ashcroft's headquarters. The room had none of the marble and glass that defined Vivian's world, only a plain wooden table, a carafe of water, and tall windows overlooking the river. Noah did not ask about the $40 and did not mention the lobby incident at all, though he was already aware of it through channels of his own, having spent enough years in business to know that the way a company treated the smallest people in a transaction often revealed more than any balance sheet ever could. He asked only one question, direct and unadorned, wanting to know whether the report attributed to Elias was genuine. Elias opened his laptop and walked him through everything, the original photographs, the laser measurements, the time-stamped video, and the entire chain of emails he had sent that had gone deliberately ignored. He spoke without embellishment, presenting the material the same way he always did, letting the data carry the weight of the argument rather than his own tone. Noah listened without interruption, occasionally leaning forward to examine a particular image more closely, asking sharp, specific questions about tolerance thresholds and load calculations that made clear he understood more about structural engineering than most executives in his position bothered to learn. When Elias finished, Noah sat back in his chair for a long moment, then instructed his own technical team to independently verify every claim against the building's blueprints and material certifications, insisting on a full review rather than a cursory glance. 2 days of quiet cross-checking followed, conducted by a small team of engineers Noah trusted implicitly, none of whom had any connection to Ashcroft Urban Holdings or any incentive to reach a particular conclusion. Their findings confirmed that Elias's original report was accurate down to the smallest detail, a full and precise match with no discrepancies anywhere in the data. Noah made his decision immediately upon reviewing their summary, freezing the entire investment pending further review, though he chose for the moment to say nothing publicly, preferring to gather every fact before taking any action that could not be undone. Vivian Ashcroft, still preparing banners and press statements for the closing ceremony, had no idea that the deal she believed was already secured had quietly stopped moving 3 days before she was scheduled to sign it, her confidence entirely undisturbed by a decision that had already been made without her knowledge. The morning of the signing arrived with the kind of polished confidence that only comes from never having been told no. Ashcroft Urban Holdings had transformed its top floor into a showcase of success, with reporters gathered near the windows, banking representatives seated along one side of a long glass table, and partners from 3 continents watching remotely through a live video feed projected onto a screen along the far wall. Wait staff circulated quietly with trays of coffee and sparkling water, and a photographer moved along the perimeter of the room, capturing candid shots meant for the following morning's press coverage. The entire floor smelled faintly of fresh flowers arranged in tall vases near the entrance, a detail Vivian had personally approved the week before. Vivian stood at the head of the room in a deep blue suit, delivering a speech about vision, growth, and the unshakable strength of her company's flagship property, her voice carrying the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment for months in front of her bathroom mirror. She spoke of trust, of partnership, and of a future built on solid foundations, gesturing occasionally toward the architectural renderings displayed on easels beside her, entirely unaware of how literally that phrase was about to be tested in front of every camera in the room. Miles Donovan stood near the back, arms folded, watching the proceedings with an unease he had not been able to shake since Rachel's departure, though he said nothing and kept his expression carefully neutral. As the final documents were being placed on the table for signature, Noah Whitmore rose slowly from his seat instead of reaching for a pen. The room quieted, uncertain at first whether this was simply part of the ceremony. Noah reached into a leather portfolio and withdrew a bound document, setting it deliberately in the center of the table where every camera in the room could see it clearly. It was the original structural report, complete with Elias Mercer's photographs, his laser readings, and his signature at the bottom of the final page, the very report Vivian had once dismissed as unworthy of her attention. A hush spread across the room as reporters leaned forward, phones already recording. Vivian's practiced smile faltered as her eyes fell on the signature at the bottom of the page, a name she had heard mentioned once in passing and had never bothered to remember. Noah addressed the room calmly, without theatrics, his voice carrying the same measured tone he had used throughout the private meeting with Elias days earlier. He explained that his fund's own engineers had independently verified every finding in the report and that the deficiency it described posed a direct risk to the safety rating underpinning the entire investment. He stated plainly that the document previously submitted to his compliance team, the one claiming no issues existed, did not match this original in its critical findings, and that his legal counsel would be reviewing the discrepancy immediately, along with the circumstances surrounding how 2 conflicting reports had come to exist in the first place. The bankers along the table exchanged uneasy glances, whispering briefly among themselves, and one of the reporters near the back of the room was already typing furiously on her phone, sensing that the story she had come to cover had just changed entirely. Vivian opened her mouth to respond, searching for the practiced confidence that had carried her through every difficult moment of her career, the same instinct that had once let her laugh off a man waiting quietly in her lobby. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, no words came at all. Within the hour, the investment fund issued a formal statement announcing it was suspending the transaction entirely, citing material misrepresentation in the due diligence documentation provided by Ashcroft Urban Holdings. The statement was brief, carefully worded by legal counsel, and made no direct accusations, though anyone reading between the lines understood exactly what had happened. Under the terms of the preliminary agreement both parties had already signed, the suspension triggered a significant penalty clause, one that required Ashcroft to compensate the fund for costs, reputational damage, and lost opportunity resulting from the failed closing. The final figure, calculated by the fund's legal team over the following days after reviewing every associated cost, came to $12 million, a number that appeared in financial headlines by the end of the week. News of the collapsed deal spread quickly through financial circles, moving from trading floors to industry newsletters within a matter of hours. By the following morning, Ashcroft Urban Holdings stock had fallen sharply as several long-standing partners quietly began withdrawing from other joint ventures, unwilling to be associated with a company whose credibility had just been publicly shattered in front of cameras. Vivian attempted damage control through a series of hastily arranged interviews, insisting the discrepancy was a simple misunderstanding between contractors and that her company remained committed to the highest standards of safety and transparency. But the explanation convinced almost no one, least of all the reporters who had watched the moment unfold live in that glass conference room and had already reviewed the falsified report themselves. As the fund's legal team began its formal inquiry into the collapsed transaction, Miles Donovan discovered something that turned an embarrassing business failure into a far more serious legal exposure. Working late one evening to prepare a defense strategy, he asked an internal technician to restore the blocked email account out of simple due diligence, expecting to find little of consequence. Instead, buried in the company's own servers, untouched since the day they had been blocked, sat the complete chain of emails Elias had sent weeks earlier, each one time-stamped, each one detailing the exact deficiency later confirmed by independent engineers, each one met with silence or deliberate obstruction. Miles read through the entire chain twice, his stomach sinking further with each message, understanding immediately how damaging the record would look to any outside investigator. The evidence made clear that Ashcroft Urban Holdings had not simply overlooked a risk through carelessness but had been formally warned repeatedly and in writing, and had chosen instead to block the warning, discredit the inspector, and manufacture a false document rather than address the problem honestly when there had still been time to do so. The fund's attorneys moved quickly once the pattern became clear, formally requesting all internal correspondence related to the inspection along with sworn statements from anyone involved in producing the falsified compliance report. Rachel Kim, though no longer employed by the company, agreed without hesitation to provide a full account of what she had witnessed, including the moment Vivian had torn the original report in half in front of her and the conversation that followed regarding the missing signature. She answered every question put to her directly and without exaggeration, providing dates, details, and context that matched precisely with the email trail already recovered from the company's servers. Her testimony, combined with the recovered correspondence, left little room for Ashcroft's legal team to maneuver or offer any alternative explanation. Vivian was formally required to accept responsibility for authorizing the falsified document, a decision that carried both significant financial penalties and lasting professional consequences that would follow her well beyond the immediate settlement. Miles Donovan, unwilling to continue defending decisions he had quietly warned against from the very beginning, resigned from his position within the week, telling colleagues privately that he could not in good conscience remain at a company that had chosen deception over a simple correction that would have cost almost nothing to make. Ashcroft Urban Holdings, once celebrated in industry publications for its rapid growth and ambitious vision, found its name now attached to headlines about corporate negligence and lost investor trust, a reputation built carefully over more than a decade unraveling in a matter of days because of a decision that had seemed at the time almost too small to matter. Roughly a week after the collapsed signing, Vivian Ashcroft asked through an intermediary whether Elias Mercer would be willing to meet her in person. She had spent the days since the ceremony largely out of public view, fielding calls from her board, her attorneys, and a handful of remaining partners still deciding whether to continue their association with her company. Somewhere in the middle of that difficult week, she had found herself returning again and again to the memory of the lobby, replaying the sound of her own laughter and wondering, for the first time in longer than she could recall, whether she had misjudged something important. Elias agreed to the meeting, choosing the same modest coffee shop where Rachel had once brought him her worries, a quiet place with wooden tables and rain-streaked windows that felt far removed from glass towers and boardrooms. Vivian arrived alone, without her usual entourage of assistants and lawyers, dressed more plainly than she had been at any point during the entire ordeal, and sat across from him carrying a small folder of her own. Inside was a cashier's check along with a written apology she had drafted and redrafted several times the night before, unsure of exactly how to put into words the weight of what had happened. She placed both items on the table between them, along with 2 crisp $20 bills, the exact sum that had started everything 3 days before the signing that broke her company's momentum. Elias looked at the check for a long moment before sliding it back across the table, untouched. He picked up only the $40, the amount he had originally been owed, folding the 2 bills carefully and placing them inside his coat pocket. He told her plainly that he had never needed her money, only for her to keep her word, and that the entire matter could have ended the very first afternoon if someone at her company had simply treated an ordinary request with ordinary respect. Vivian tried once more to push the check across the table, insisting that he had earned far more than the settlement reflected, that the damage to his reputation and his time deserved real compensation. But Elias only shook his head and repeated that money had never been the issue at any point in the story. Vivian sat in silence, the weight of the statement settling over her more heavily than any legal penalty had managed to. She thought back to the lobby, to the sound of her own laughter echoing off the marble floor, to the ease with which she had waved away a man who had done nothing except ask to be paid for work he had honestly completed. She had looked at a man waiting quietly in her lobby and decided he was not worth her attention, that his request was too small to matter, that his time carried no value next to her own. 3 days later, that single decision, made in a moment of careless pride, had cost her company $12 million, driven away partners who had trusted her for years, and unraveled a reputation she had spent her entire career building from nothing. She left the coffee shop that afternoon without the check ever having been accepted, carrying instead a lesson she would spend a long time trying to fully absorb. In the months that followed, Elias Mercer's independent consulting practice grew steadily, his name circulating quietly among developers and investment firms as someone whose word could be trusted completely, someone who documented everything and compromised on nothing regardless of who sat across the table from him. Requests for his services began arriving faster than he could accept them, many from companies that had heard the story secondhand and wanted, above all else, an inspector who could not be pressured or dismissed. He remained the same in every meeting, arriving early, measuring twice, and refusing to sign anything he had not personally verified, unchanged by the sudden attention his name now attracted in certain circles. Noah Whitmore, impressed by the composure and precision Elias had shown throughout the entire ordeal, formally invited him to join the investment fund as a senior advisor on risk assessment, a role Elias accepted on the condition that he could continue his independent inspections alongside it, unwilling to give up the fieldwork that had shaped his entire career. The two men developed a quiet, professional respect for one another over the following months, built less on conversation than on the simple fact that each had proven in his own way that thoroughness mattered more than convenience. Rachel Kim, after months of uncertainty and several difficult weeks searching for new work, found a position at a firm that valued exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous diligence that had once cost her a job and later helped expose the truth at Ashcroft Urban Holdings. She often thought back to the evening she had made the call to Elias, a decision that had felt uncertain and even reckless at the time, and came to understand it as the moment she had chosen, without fully realizing it, to trust her own judgment over the comfort of staying silent. The story of the man who was refused $40 and the company that lost $12 million because of it began circulating in business circles as a quiet lesson about the true cost of arrogance, repeated at conferences and cited occasionally in articles about corporate governance and risk management. It became, over time, a reminder that respect owed to any person, regardless of the size of the transaction in front of them, is never as small as it appears in the moment it is withheld, and that the true measure of a company often reveals itself not in how it treats its largest partners, but in how it treats the quiet, ordinary people it assumes no one is watching.